In the desperate years of World War II, while bombs fell over London and tanks clashed across Europe, Britain's war cabinet quietly considered a plan so grim it reads like the plot of a dystopian novel. It wasn't about bullets, bombs, or blitzkriegs. It was about unleashing one of the deadliest bacteria known to science, anthrax. The plan had an innocuous-sounding name, Operation Vegetarian, but its aim was anything but harmless. By 1942, the war's outcome was still uncertain. Hitler's armies controlled vast swaths of Europe, and Britain was struggling to hold out against the Nazi war machine. In this climate of existential threat, military planners explored every possible weapon that could tip the scales. Among these ideas was the use of biological warfare, a concept that had been discussed in hushed tones since the First World War, but had never been deployed on a massive scale. The thinking behind Operation Vegetarian was brutally simple. Instead of targeting soldiers, it would target the German food supply. The plan was to drop millions of specially prepared linseed cakes, animal feed, laced with Bacillus anthracis, the bacterium that causes anthrax, over fields and pastures in northern Germany. Cattle would eat the cakes, contract anthrax, and die. The resulting meat shortage would starve not only the livestock, but the civilian population dependent on them. The name vegetarian was darkly ironic. It imagined a Germany suddenly without meat, its people forced to survive on whatever scraps they could find. To test the idea, Britain needed a place remote enough to keep the experiment secret, but large enough to simulate real conditions. They chose Gruinard Island, a small uninhabited patch of land off the coast of Scotland. In 1942, scientists from the top-secret Portondown research facility brought sheep to the island and deliberately exposed them to anthrax spores. Within days, the animals were dead, their bodies swollen and blackened by the disease. The tests proved anthrax was devastatingly effective, but also terrifyingly persistent. Soil samples taken weeks later still teemed with spores. The island was so contaminated it remained off-limits for nearly 50 years. By 1944, Britain had manufactured 5 million anthrax-laced linseed cakes, all ready to be loaded into bombers and scattered over Germany. The plan was actually scheduled for the summer of 1944, when cattle would be grazing out in the fields. But then, well, the war began to turn. The Allies landed in Normandy, the German front started to collapse, and military leaders decided that such a catastrophic measure just wasn't necessary anymore. Operation Vegetarian was quietly shelved, and the stockpiled cakes were destroyed in incinerators after the war. Had the plan actually been carried out, the consequences would have been, honestly, unimaginable. Anthrax spores can survive in soil for decades, and in some cases, even centuries. Vast areas of German farmland could have been rendered completely unusable for generations. Livestock would have perished, food production would have collapsed, and starvation could have killed millions. Worse still, anthrax can infect humans directly. Any people exposed during the bombing or through contaminated meat might have died in agony, and because there was no quick way to decontaminate the land, the impact could have lasted far beyond the war itself. The moral and ethical questions are, well, staggering. Was it justifiable to starve and poison an entire civilian population to end the war more quickly? Would it have been any different from the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which, killed tens of thousands in an instant? Or would it have been worse, a slow, lingering death for millions, coupled with environmental destruction on a continental scale? In the decades after the war, Gruinard Island became a grim reminder of what could have been. The contaminated soil made it too dangerous for visitors, and signs warning of anthrax danger were posted along its shores. It wasn't until 1986, after an intensive decontamination effort involving formaldehyde and seawater, that the island was finally declared safe. Today, it's uninhabited, a quiet, wind-swept place, but one with a dark history buried in its soil. Operation Vegetarian remains one of the most chilling what-ifs of the Second World War. It was a plan born out of desperation, rooted in the belief that survival justified any means. Yet it also stands as a warning about the uncontrollable nature of biological warfare. Once unleashed, Bacteria like anthrax do not respect borders, military objectives, or even the passage of time. They linger, invisible and deadly, long after the politics that set them free have faded into history. In the end, Britain never needed to carry out the plan. The war ended with Germany's surrender in May 1945, brought about by a combination of military victories, economic collapse, and political defeat. But the very existence of Operation Vegetarian reminds us that history is full of turning points that hinge not only on what was done, but also on what was almost done. Sometimes, the most dangerous weapons are the ones that stay in the shadows, waiting for a moment that, thankfully, never comes.